Hi, I'm Nick Haig, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Today, I'd like to welcome Pia Lauritzen to the podcast. Pia is a Danish philosopher, writer, and inventor. Last year, she was selected for the Thinkers 50 radar list, and that's what spotlights thinkers with the ideas that are most likely to shape the future. She's a regular contributor to the magazine Strategy and Business and has written 5 books on the nature and impact of questions focusing on leadership, technology, and cultural diversity. As a career researcher, I've always had more questions than answers, so I'm delighted to speak to Pia today. She definitely has the answers, having spent 20 years researching the nature and impact of questions. Welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Pia.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you for being here. Well, to all our listeners, Pia is a philosopher. She's a writer, inventor, and entrepreneur. And I think a great starting point today is if you could give some background on who you are, the work you do, of course, but also some background on the books, the many books that you've written over the years.
Yeah, I'd love to. I think I'm primarily a philosopher. I think of myself as someone whose main job is to think and to read and to write and to connect with other people about, what we could call the big questions. Some of the questions that sometimes we forget to ask the questions and connect around the questions. Typically, I talk about the 3 big E's: the existential, ethical, and epistemological questions. So these are questions that all of us are asking from time to time, but sometimes during adulthood, primarily, we are so busy asking another kind of questions on how to be effective and productive and stuff like that we forget to ask these kind of questions. So I think I consider it my job to remind myself and others to ask these questions, because I strongly believe that these are the questions that make us human. And coming from a philosophical research background, combining that with being a management consultant, but also a tech inventor, I realized at some point that to change some of the patterns and structures we have in society and in organizations, we also need different kinds of technologies and different ways of working and different ways of connecting with each other. So that brought me into trying to invent new kinds of technologies that help people connect with each other.
Yeah. And we'll get into that because you created something called Question. You've also got something called Question Jam, but you've also written 5 books, is it, in total?
Yeah, that's right. I started out writing in Danish because I'm from Denmark. So all of my books are in Danish, and then 2 of them have been translated into English as well. And I think that has been part of my research. So when doing university research, I fairly quickly realized that writing articles for academic peers was not I didn't think that was that much fun. I like to communicate with people outside of the university. So I thought that if I started to write books instead of writing papers for journals, then I would have more people to talk about these philosophical topics with. So I had been writing books about, my first book was very, very philosophical, focusing on a few German and a few French philosophers and how they rephrase the question of what it means to be human and the impact it has on how we understand ourselves and each other. And then I've been writing books about leadership and culture and technology on how these very big topics intersect, with the intersection between these big topics, and how philosophy can help shed light on some of these discussions.
Well, I'm glad you broadened your reach with your audience you were looking to meet too, because in that sense, I came across your book Questions, and that's definitely one that I'd like to talk about today. As background, my father was a career market researcher, so I grew up at mealtime around the kitchen table, often being posed many different questions. So unknowingly, my career path was being set from that early age. And I then went on to become a career market researcher before turning into asking questions on a podcast. But, I've spent my whole life, therefore, asking questions. And it wasn't until I read your book, which is behind me on the shelf here, entitled Questions, that I too questioned, why we ask questions, the importance of questions, and how, as you say, that all tracks back to us being human. So the background to you writing this book in the first instance, what made you turn to write this book?
So actually, I wrote this book 10 years ago, and I wrote it in Danish. So at the time, I just received a grant to do postdoctoral studies at the university. So I had 2 years to dive into the nature and impact of questions, because that was kind of the project that I set out to do, the research project that I set out to do. So I was in the beginning of that, and the reason I applied for this grant was that I had at the time been doing studies in Danish organizations for a few years as a consultant. So I think I collected maybe 3,000 questions or something like that, asked by employees and leaders working in Danish organizations. And I started to see some patterns. I started to see, okay, it looks like I can see some patterns in what questions are people asking, how are they asking them, to whom are they asking their questions. Are there some blind spots in here? So I was starting to get curious about if the patterns that I saw, if they were telling me something about what it means to be Danish, or what it means to be, from Scandinavia, building business in the Nordics, or, in Europe, or if I saw something that maybe had to do with humanity at a larger scale. Is this something that has to do with being human? So I applied for a grant to explore the differences and similarities between how people living in different language cultures ask questions, and how they use questions to connect with each other, but also to explore the world and understand how to navigate uncertainty, for instance. So I did observational studies of a Russian and a Spanish and a Chinese and a Danish school class to figure out, how do we raise our children to deal with the unknown, and to deal with, exploring and being curious about how to understand themselves and the world they are part of. So that was the 2-year postdoctoral study project, and I fairly soon realized that. That I had to broaden this discussion, as I mentioned before, that this was not a discussion that had to do only with philosophers or academics. So, and the university I was working at, Aarhus University, they had this series of books where they, invited senior researchers to communicate their topics in a 60-page, very short, light way for everyone to read. So I just reached out to the publicist and said, well, I have this idea. I think I would like to write a book about questions, and I would like to be it about, the history of questions, the philosophy of questions, the language part, the very practical part, the questions my kids are asking in the morning. Yeah. I wanted to cover, as much as possible, go back to the beginning, who asked the first question in history of humanity, looking at the Bible, look at the Quran to see some cultural patterns, and he was just like, yeah, we're going to do that. Let's write that book. You should write that book. So it's a very ambitious book in 60 pages, trying to really give all round perspective on how many situations and parts of life that questions actually play a role in being human.
Well, it's always harder to write a more succinct, shorter book, that gets to the point, as opposed to a longer, rambling book, isn't it? And I think you've achieved that for sure with the book itself. As I mentioned, I'm a career researcher, so I suppose it's inbuilt that I'm inquisitive in nature, and therefore, my job, asking questions, but always having this thirst for knowledge, and maybe research has always been my destiny, therefore. And I suppose, to quote another philosopher that you mentioned in the book, Plato, is the road from ignorance to knowledge travels through questions, and we can achieve this true knowledge only by continuously asking sharp and relevant questions. So I'm definitely still, got that hunger to learn and looking to build on my knowledge all the time. So enjoyed the book. Having spent my entire life asking questions, I know that questions are not always easy to ask. And in fact, I think in some instances, when we used to speak to the junior execs, they can be dangerous if you don't construct them, because by that I mean, if you ask a question, you'll always get an answer, but you might have a leading question, it might be asked poorly, and you might not get the answer that you're looking to get. So from all the research you've done, what's your best advice on how you should ask a question that's free of bias?
Yeah, so Nick, I actually think I want to explore that with you, because I think when I get asked that question, and when I read about and hear about this ambition to ask and to approach the world from an unbiased place, I always tend to think that's not going about it the right way. I get the feeling that, at least when it comes to asking questions, we should not try to be unbiased. We should not try to let go of our perspective or our way of being in the world, our way of seeing the world. Because when it comes to questions, it's so basic human nature that if we try to ignore the fact that we ask questions from a place, from a specific place in time, and a specific place, I'm standing here and not there. I'm seeing the world from this perspective, from this place, and in this part of history. If I try to ignore that, or if I try to let go of the fact that I am situated, so to speak, then I will have a hard time connecting with the person I'm asking my question. So I think there's something deeper than what we're asking. There's something deeper going on, and that is the fact that we are asking, that we are being open to not knowing, that we are acknowledging that we need each other to move forward. And that's the place we want to ask the question from. So if we try to be unbiased, we kind of neglect the most important thing when asking a question. What are your thoughts about that? Does that make sense?
Well, I do get that, because you're asking the question because you're inquisitive. You've got an ulterior motive to try and get to somewhere, get the answer that you're looking to get from another person or the respondents, if it's a focus group, for example, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, no, I understand that. I think, I suppose what you're always looking to do is get those honest answers rather than conclusions that the asker's wanting them to hear, isn't it?
And if that's the case, then I think you should go about it very differently, actually. Then I think, instead of asking your own questions, you should invite people to ask questions themselves. Because if you really want to figure out what's on their mind and what's important to them and where their focus is, then you need to have them asking questions. So you need to create a space, or cultivate an environment, or a way of being together where the other person feels comfortable sharing their questions, sharing their wonder and their doubt and their skepticism. Because if they start sharing that, you will have access to what they think is important. So if that's what you really want, you should kind of flip the script, and invite other people to ask their own questions. I think that at least that's what my research shows. So that is the not the easiest, but it's definitely the most valuable way to get access to what's on other people's minds and what's important to them. That is by listening to the questions they are asking themselves and asking each other.
Yeah, I agree. And that two-way conversation. And I think also, and therefore probably that's why focus groups are very important as a research toolkit, but and in constructing a question, you need to be also aware of the medium of how you're asking that, because, we're bombarded by questions these days, aren't we? From, being in a hotel room and something, did you have a nice stay? Email. It might be something written down. It might be a phone call. It might be a face-to-face conversation, and these different ways you can ask questions as well delivers different answers sometimes, through that engagement or how you've phrased the question itself.
Yeah, and I actually, coming from a philosophical perspective, I think we should let go of thinking about questions as a tool and as something we need to, where we take. I think we have too many manuals and ideas and theories about how to ask questions and what to ask and what not to ask, and I think it's actually making a lot of people a bit tired, and it's making it more difficult than it needs to be to share what's on our mind. Because, as you said, if we are bombarded with questions all the time, and they build on the same method or the same framework or the same idea of how to ask questions or what questions to ask, then we get a bit tired and we start thinking of questions as a way to connect with each other and as a way to share knowledge that is important to both of us. Because questions are, when they are best, they are, making both of us smarter. It's not only, you're not only becoming smarter because I respond to your questions, I'm also getting smarter because I start reflecting on how I actually relate to whatever you ask me. So I think that's what in everybody's interest to create these spaces sometimes. Not all the time. I know there's a lot. Sometimes you just need to collect information. But if you never step into that space where people are actually learning from each other and connecting on something new, then I think we grow, we get stuck in the way we communicate with each other.
Totally agree. Customer experience is a topic close to my heart, and Fred Reichheld, I don't know whether you know or have read his book. He's from Bain Consultancy, so he famously wrote his book, The Ultimate Question. And for those listeners who haven't read the book, it's primarily about one metric called the Net Promoter Score, or NPS, and it's a metric used in customer experience, customer satisfaction programs to measure how loyal customers are to a company. It's a simple question that is asked to establish your customer's perception. How likely are you to recommend organization X to a friend or colleague? From all the research that you've done, do you think there is such a thing as the ultimate question?
I think either the answer is yes, definitely, or it's no, definitely not. It's like, and I think actually the question could be both. The ultimate question, I think there are ultimate questions, but I think they are, in a situation, you can have a conversation where you can see if that question had not been asked, the conversation would not have reached, this magical insights or this magical connection. So to me, that would be an ultimate question, but you don't know in advance. It's kind of like you have to figure out along the way. And sometimes you only know it afterwards. And sometimes you need someone else to tell you the question you asked right there made a huge difference. If you think you can figure it out before you ask the question, then I would say chances are you're not going to ask the ultimate question. That being said, I want to be respectful for, the question you mentioned, because what I really think is beautiful about that is that it demonstrates that the person asking the question or the company asking the question acknowledges that it's the relationship between the person answering and someone else that determines whether this is a successful product, a successful transaction. And I think that is very, that's a profound insight, that when you ask someone a question, that you don't assume that you are the most important person in their life, that you actually make room for the fact that there's something else going on and there's someone else that's more important as to whether you're going to continue using this product. It's not me, it's not the CEO, it's not, the brand. It's what's going on in the conversations between you and your peers, you and your family, and that is extremely insightful. I think that's what makes the question effectful. That is that it acknowledges that something else is going on.
Well, I love that answer, actually, Pia. I wasn't sure what you'd say, and I didn't know whether I was being flippant in posing that question. But I do love that answer that you've given there. I mean, equally, I agree. I mean, it's a powerful question, and that's why it's caught on, and lots of boards of companies use it as a customer experience, customer loyalty metric. But I do know from 25 years of experience that asking a question normally does result in another question needing to be asked, which is, I suppose, fundamental to some techniques like laddering techniques and things like that. But what I do know is that, even with the MPS, for example, it's not a silver bullet question. And even Fred Reichhold would admit that, because, actually you do need to follow it up with why did you say that to really get under the skin of the numeric score anyway. So, but you're right. The way that it frames it in how you might talk to others does show that it's, it positions the question in a different manner to just saying, are you satisfied or not?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How we ask questions definitely isn't straightforward, and especially when we look at how we ask questions in different languages and across different cultures. Again, I'm going back to my previous life, my previous research, but an example being in qualitative research, we'd often use projective questions like, if you had a magic wand, what would you change, as opposed to saying, what would you really like to, again, getting people to think outside the box more creatively. But I think the problem with that is, and I remember one Italian interviewer, coming up to me in the office saying, Nick, you just can't ask this question to someone in Italy. It just doesn't work. They're not going to take it seriously, or take it literally, and not be able to answer that. So, how important is it to understand cultural diversity and background of a respondent in order to get a sensible answer when asking questions?
I think it is as important as it is to understand that whoever you're sitting across is a very different human being than you are. And cultural differences can be a way of taking a step closer to not to understand what's going on in the person sitting across of you, but more like, or sitting in front of you, but more like, to me, it's more about you than it's about the person you're asking. It's about you being able to sit in a position where you are completely open to the fact and willing to admit to yourself and to the person you are talking to that you really don't know the answer. That you're asking from a place where you are being curious, from a human place, not from a salesperson place or from but from a human place. And sometimes I've met salespeople who have been blown away by their ability to do that, but I have also met salespeople who are not, or market people who naturally start thinking about the act of asking questions as something they do as part of their job. But the second we do that, the second we take questions as, I almost want to say, hostage. When we take questions hostage as something we can use to gain what we want, the knowledge we want, or the behavior we wish to see in the other person, then we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to learn. And I think when it comes to culture, there are some. That's what my studies showed. My postdoctoral studies I mentioned before, where I studied these school classes with Chinese, Russian, Spanish, and Danish children. I could see some basic differences in how we are raised to understand and use questions. And these are on a linguistic grammar level. It's differences in the grammar that makes us understand and use questions differently. So I found three basic differences, or three basic ways of using questions. One is, and that's the one we have in the UK, in Denmark, in the Nordics, in English-speaking countries. We use questions to impose responsibility on someone else. So the second you ask a question, it's my responsibility to come up with a response. You're just waiting. Now it's your turn, Pia, right? So that's how we use questions. We ask a question, now it's your turn. In the Chinese school class, I could see the exact opposite going on. So when the teacher asks a question, everyone looks at the teacher for the correct answer. So it's not like now it's the student's turn. It is, but nobody expects the student to know the answer. to know the right answer. It's only been answered, the question, when the teacher has said, okay, so that was the right answer.
Okay.
So that is a completely different way of using questions, where we would ask questions like, how are you? I cannot answer how you are. You have to answer that question. But that question would not be relevant in the same context. And the third way of using questions, so as me, there's you, and the third question is, it's neither me nor you. This is about learning something together. This is about looking at something and both being open to not having the answer, because we're going to figure out the answer together. We're going to find out how to understand this problem or this world or, this product or whatever, by talking to each other about, and by learning and by sharing what we know, each of us. And these three basic ways of understanding and using questions, it goes without saying that we behave very differently when a question is being asked if we are from one or the other. When let's say a Danish leader is traveling to a Chinese team, something like that, asking a question, and she goes back thinking, well, nobody. I said to everyone, do you have any questions? Nobody asked me anything, so everybody knows what to do. And then she gets back and she realizes, people are doing very different things right now. Why didn't they ask me so I could tell them what to do? But that makes so much sense when you know that if the Chinese employee asked a question, he or she would put it on herself to come up with the right answer. And she's not in a position to do that. Because she's an employee to the leader. So figuring out and knowing these basic differences, and it makes so much sense with the Italian, colleague you were mentioning, because they belong to a different language culture than the Anglo-American, Scandinavian way of using questions. So and if we don't know that, and we don't, then we constantly use questions in a way where we risk to disconnect rather than connect with each other.
B2B Frameworks is a curated collection of proven business frameworks to develop your strategic thinking skills, solve your biggest business problems, and unlock your next promotion. Our mission is to help you achieve these goals. We want to create the next generation of successful business leaders by providing the tools and frameworks needed to create effective strategies that drive business growth. Each framework comes with a downloadable set of instructions with large, colourful diagrams and editable templates to guide you through the process step by step and prompt you to consider the problem from every possible angle. Along with audio guides and educational tools, our extensive content library is full of real-world examples and case studies of strategic thinking in action. So why learn with B2B Frameworks? We've carefully curated only the most effective, proven business and marketing frameworks. Our downloadable materials and audio guides will help you easily apply each framework. And the insights and advice you'll find across the site are based on 30 years of consulting experience from one of the world's leading business strategy experts, Paul Haig. B2B Frameworks is a small investment to advance your career or grow your business. Start your journey to becoming a successful business leader by joining B2B Frameworks today. And I think going back to what we talked about before with the NPS score, for example, how people score on a scale of response differs so greatly depending on where you are in the world. And even, here in Europe, myself here in the UK, yourself in Denmark, us Northern Europeans score very differently to the Southern Europeans, like you say, to the Italians and the Spanish, and then very differently to the Americans who use the top end of the scale often, whereas, and in Asia, it's a whole melting pot of differences on, some of those Southeast Asian countries, go to the extremes, whereas the Japanese more likely to, they don't want to offend, so they're more likely to use the middle of the scale. So these cultural differences are so important, aren't they, to understand when, not only when constructing a question, but then when analysing what's coming back, that listening part, as you say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I was fascinated by your TED talk called What You Don't Know About Questions. And what I found interesting, and it's relating to what we've just been talking about, is the fact that if you want to know something, it's not always about asking questions, but sometimes it's about waiting and, more importantly, listening rather than asking questions. And I love the analogy you use around, well, I think you talk about your son, and then you talk about, some of your work colleagues in one of your jobs, but it's more of this dance of toing and froing rather than this interrogation session, just, in one direction. Could you expand on that, please, for our listeners? Because I think it's fascinating.
Yes. To me, dancing is very much about trust. It's about trusting myself and my own, my body, my mind, my breath, how I am at the moment. If I even feel like dancing, sometimes I don't, because I'm not in a place where dancing feels like the right thing to do. So dancing for me is about trusting myself, but it's also very much about trusting the person you're dancing with. If you don't trust the other person to take a step back when you're taking a step forward, and to take a step to the side when you're taking a step to the side, but also trusting him to, when he takes a step back, then I take a step forward. If you don't have that trust, then dancing can be extremely difficult and uncomfortable. And I think it's the same thing with conversations. If we don't trust each other to contribute with our perspectives and take turns, so to speak, in asking and answering, if we always assume that I'm the one asking and you're the one answering, or the other way around, then we are not having a conversation. We're doing something else. And for me, questioning should be, at least from a human perspective, should be about conversations. Then sometimes we have interviews, like podcast interview, or or we give an interview to the media, something like that, and then the roles are more fixed. Then it's more like, okay, we have one person asking and another one answering. But in a larger perspective, and what we do most, when we talk to our colleagues, when we talk to our boss, when we talk to our family, then we should aim at this dancing analogy, in my perspective, and paying attention to, am I making room for the other person to be part of this dance, or I'm either moving ahead all the time, asking all the questions, or just standing waiting for someone else to take the first step. Sometimes I need to, although it can be uncomfortable, as you mentioned in the beginning, asking questions can feel uncomfortable, and it can be a bit dangerous, because you never know what's going to happen. But you need to trust yourself and the other person to take that step, because otherwise you might as well, go for a walk yourself.
Yeah. So it's about getting this balance. You don't want to be asking all the questions all the time, and the most healthy way to do this is to listen as just as much. Again, I'm after not studying philosophy at all before reading your book. I'm now knee deep in quoting philosophers, but as Epictetus said, we have two ears and one mouth, so we listen twice as much as we speak. So definitely.
Yeah, and for me, I think that what's new in there, because I think we know that we know we know that we should listen, and we know that we have two ears, but what I think is not necessarily new, but something we tend to forget, is that we should not only listen when people answer our questions, we should also listen when they are asking questions. Sometimes when someone asks you a question, you're so busy answering that you don't take the time to understand, what was he actually asking? What was he aiming at? And sometimes it can be, it can really take the conversation to the next level by simply stopping for a moment and say, I'm not quite sure I'm not sure I understood what the question was really about. Can you please tell me a little bit more? It's why are you asking this question in this way? And you shouldn't say it, blaming the other person, but more exploring what were your intentions, and what are you hoping to get out of this conversation based on that question. That's sometimes, listening to the questions other people are asking. We sometimes forget that, but that's really, really valuable when they're connecting with other human beings.
I don't know what it's like in Denmark, but I know here in the UK, MPs are the worst for not listening, and not, they've got their own agenda and they're going to give that answer no matter what,
Yeah.
even though the question might be trying to get at something else.
Yeah.
In your book, you talk about the structure of the question, and we talked a bit about this today as well, and the fact that questions are this powerful tool, because when we ask questions, we're not only put ourselves in a position to address something, but we're also putting that person who's answering in a position to address something, and then focusing our attention on that particular topic that otherwise may have not been thought about. And I think to that point, you've created this online digital tool called Quest to help employees and leaders alike from organizations to focus their attention on otherwise unheard initiatives or strategies that might be brewing within an organization. I'm fascinated by what this tool is. Could you talk to our listeners about a bit more about the background, how it works?
Yeah, so it's based on my philosophical research. Realizing that when human beings ask questions, that's where they are open to new knowledge. That's where they are being curious about learning and growing. Made me realize that a lot of the tools we use in organizations, both to understand what's going on in the organization and among customers, but also you're so analyzing, but also engaging and empowering organizations. The tools we use are built on a one-to-many logic, and it's also based on a monopolization of questions. So if you think about interviews or focus groups or particularly surveys, employee engagement surveys, customer satisfaction surveys, we have a few people asking questions of a lot of respondents. We even call it respondents. So these are people whose job is to react to the questions we are asking. They are not supposed to interact with each other. They are not supposed to be proactive and ask their own questions. They are just supposed to respond to whatever the HR manager or the consultant came up with, what they thought were important to ask. So when I realized that, I decided that it would be interesting to see what would happen if we democratize the power of question, if we kind of make a flipped survey, where instead of just asking people a lot of generic questions, we invite them to ask each other questions. It should be as easy as, responding to a survey. So it needed to be digital. It needed to be, in writing. But the whole idea is that you set a topic, a strategic topic. It can be, our company throughout the digital transformation, or, using AI as a leverage for how to build our new strategy, or whatever, some topic that has some interest to the organization. And then you invite a group of people. It can be 50 people, but it can be hundreds or thousands of people. You invite to join a conversation on a digital platform where each and every employee gets the prompt to ask a question of someone else in the organization. So, and it should be relevant to the topic. But other than that, I decide myself what I want to ask as a participant and who I want to ask. So let's say I write a question saying, why should we even consider AI when it comes to strategy? It seems a bit odd to me. Why do you think we should do that? And then I pick you from the participant list and say, Nick, I would like you to answer this question. And then you receive an email saying one of your colleagues asked you a question. You cannot see who it is, so I can ask my question, anonymous. And then you respond, and then you get to ask a new question. So it's kind of like a relay. Within a work week, people are exchanging questions and answers one-on-one about a shared topic. And when the quest closes, everyone gets access to the output. So you can see, network visualization showing how did we communicate, which teams did receive which kind of questions. You can see a word cloud, the words that people have been using when talking about this topic, helping senior management to see what's on people's mind. What are they talking about? What are they not talking about? And that's interactive. So as a participant, you can click the word cloud so you can see, what did my colleagues ask? What are their uncertainties or their doubts and curiosities? So this is a basic tool to engage people in a conversation they would otherwise not have, at least not in a large scale. And at the same time, an analytics tool making it easier for decision makers to see what are the important conversations and important topics for us to address in the organization in order to align our efforts.
Well, it sounds fascinating, Pia. It really does, and I think having run many employee engagement studies, CX surveys over the time, but what I do know internally within employee engagement in large corporates, it's often one-way traffic of questions coming from the upper echelons of a company down, whereas we all know that the most successful companies thrive on having an inclusive culture because they're open to hearing what the broader organization has to say. So I think you even mention it, whether it's in your book or whether it's an article that I read in putting these questions together, that when people ask questions of someone else, they're both open to new knowledge and willing to act on that knowledge more so. So I love that idea because they're owning the issue, therefore, aren't they? In order to take it on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you only have people responding to questions, then it's someone else owning the responsibility for, how to deal with that. Because okay, so you asked the question, I'm just giving you your answer. Now I expect you to do something with it. But the second I both ask and answer, thinking of the dance, the second
Yeah.
I engage in both asking and answering, then I better understand, this is a two-way street. This is something where I have a responsibility as well. And I need to trust, if to ask a question, I need to trust that I will receive an answer and I will engage with my peers about a topic that's important. So I think, as I mentioned, this was my way of seeing, can I build technology that can help tap into what I know, how I know questions can help people connect to each other and commit to a shared purpose. If we have technology that do the opposite, where we have some people asking and a lot of people responding, what would happen if we have technology that actually support this democratization of questions, that support this unleashing of the power of questions? And my experience is that a lot of very interesting thing happens, and it makes it so much easier for everyone to align on the same strategic journey.
Yeah. Yeah. To conclude, I'm going to enter the quick fire round of questions I ask my other guests here. So to start with, lots of books behind you for the YouTube watchers. So you're obviously interested in books. What are you reading at the moment?
At the moment, I'm reading a book by a Danish journalist writing about when the attack on the Congress in 2021 in the U.S. And understanding the polarization in the U.S. at the moment. And it's extremely inspiring reading a journalist who's been living in the U.S. for decades and interviewing, from all perspectives of what's going on in the US right now. I think it's very inspiring.
Yeah, yeah. And for our listeners out there, and for myself probably, who are interested in learning more about philosophy, I'm sure there's many books, many hard and complicated books, maybe. But what about some books that we can dip ourselves into to introduce us to the topic? Are there any, apart from your own, of course, that you'd recommend us to read?
Actually, I typically recommend people to read novels and literature rather than going directly to the philosophers, because I know, from my own experience, that it takes a lot of, even for a trained philosophical professional, it takes a lot of time and a lot of work to even get the idea of why are they writing this. It's so it's so difficult. Why does it have to be so difficult? And to me, it obviously it makes sense. The reason they are doing that is that they are dealing with the questions that arise before, between, and beyond the sciences. So they are dealing with the questions that cannot be put into a fixed and final, framework telling you how to follow this step by step, and then this will happen. Because they're dealing with all the in betweens, they have to do something else with language as well, and with their way of describing things. And I actually think there's a lot of brilliant literature that does that to you, where you get the sense that something else is going on. And art, looking at something that an artist did, or reading something that an artist wrote, connects you with the same philosophical sense, of being human. So typically, I would recommend reading novels by there's a French a novelist. I don't know if you know him, Michel Houellebecq, for instance.
I know the name. I've not read any of his
No,
books.
but I like reading him because I think, and I like reading. Uh, I don't read French, but I read translations. I like reading authors coming from different parts of the world, so it's not always English speaking, but it can be something else. I think that can help people connect with some of the philosophical aspirations that I'm talking about.
Which business leader do you most admire and why? And by business leader, it doesn't need to be a famous leader. It can be any leader. It doesn't need to be the CEO of a particular company. Anyone that you've come across in your working life that you admire.
I've written a few articles for the magazine called Strategy and Business, and I realized at some point that I tend to share the stories of the leaders I admire. So, in these articles, I wrote an article about Audi in Germany, an article about Lego here in Denmark, and Grundfos also here in Denmark. They are large global companies, but they are headquartered here in Europe. And I shared the stories of these leaders. It's middle managers. It's not the C-suite. It's people working in the organization, and against all odds, somehow they manage to create or to nurture a culture of curiosity, a culture of people feeling okay, not knowing the answers, and preparing themselves for the future by learning from each other rather than telling each other what to do and how to do it. So I have a few examples of these middle managers, or that I find truly inspiring, because I actually have no idea how they do it. I know I wouldn't be able to do it myself. I wouldn't be able to be in a large system, big corporation, where, every structure is designed for me to do something. And then somehow I managed to do something else. I managed to, create something that's different. I really admire that.
Do you know Celine Schillinger?
Only by name.
Yeah, she. So her podcast is going out the couple of weeks before yours. So that's going out in next week, in real time as we speak. But she wrote a book. It's on my shelf there. Called Dare to Unlead, and a lot of that is talking about from her position within Sanofi and how she started to make change and understand that things needed to be done differently. And she leans on lots of other different examples, but she leans on her first-hand experience, and it's a great book, so I recommend that.
Great.
But yeah, I've seen it firsthand as well from research that I've done in the past. Grundfos used to be one of my clients, but lots of other clients as well, where you see it, whether it's in a global organization and just a country starts to do things differently, or within like you say, within middle management, that they take on a role and start to show change, and then someone from on top within the C-suite starts to grab onto that idea and say, hold on a minute, I can see some change happening here for the good. Let's unpack that and see if we can deliver it wider. So I think there's lots of stories that I can relate to in how you mentioned that.
Yeah, and also the patience. I'm so impressed by the patience of working. And I have this client I've been working with for, I think, maybe 8 years or something like that. He's in Vestas, and so many times I lost trust in things moving forward, and he just keeps coming back. Then then maybe it's a year, maybe 2 years, but then he comes back, and then I can see all the things he's been doing that has, moved a very, very, because that's how it is with very big legacy companies. Things move slowly, and I just get so impatient. And these people, these heroes, they keep trusting that, well, but tomorrow we will be a little bit closer, and the day after that a little bit closer, and I'm just I really think, that's the kind of people we need in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. My final question, Pia, is who would you like me to reach out to and invite to come on this podcast in the future?
I trust you to know who to reach out to. I'm not sure I can help you very much, but I do have two names that I thought of. One is the former chair of Carlsberg here in Denmark. His name is Flemming Besenbacher. He's also a professor in physics, because that's something I really appreciate about some of the large European companies we have, that they are not only, in the business for business, they also have a very huge responsibility and take on a very huge responsibility for developing science and for helping society to stay responsible and grow in a sustainable manner. And Carlsberg is one of these companies that have a huge, funding foundation, and he was where it has until recently it has been a professor who was the chairman for the business as well. And I think that's so cool. It says so much about how to run a business, to say, well, we want a professor to be our chairman. And he stepped down. He retired a few years back. But he's extremely inspiring and doing a lot of work on the sustainability agenda, the youth agenda. Every year he's part of gathering 1,000 talents from across the globe. So young people discussing and dealing with the sustainability agenda. That's extremely inspiring. I think you would enjoy talking to him. The other one is an American management thinker called Greg Sattel. I don't know if you know him.
No, I don't.
But he's been writing a lot for HBR and doing a lot of really interesting work on innovation and on transformation. And he's been studying a lot of societal aspects also in Ukraine. So he's been living in Ukraine for a lot of years, for a lot of years ago. But so he has a lot of interesting perspective. I'm always looking for people looking at management and looking at organizations, combining different perspectives. So whether it's, from a global perspective, saying, okay, I'm an American, but I have this European experience combining, or it's from, I'm doing research as a professor in physics, but I'm also doing business for a large corporation. I think people combining things that you wouldn't necessarily think was combined. I think that's also that's always very inspiring.
Well, both Greg and Flemming sound like perfect guests, and ones that'd be really interesting to speak to, and I'm sure our listeners would agree. So I will definitely reach out to both of those and try and find some time in their diaries. Pia, I want to thank you so much for joining me today, taking time out of a busy schedule. Hopefully today's discussion has got people's grey matter thinking about the power of questions, but also the importance of listening. And if you harness the power of questions and listening, it can help you make better decisions and hopefully be more emphatic and purpose-driven with those decisions in the future. When I was doing some research on you, Pia, then there's lots out there, YouTube, but I know I visited your site, pialauritzen.dk. Is that where you'd point people to if they want any more information on your work and how you can help them?
Yeah, it is. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'd love to connect with people on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I must say that there's a lot of information on your website, but what I loved is those lovely visualized graphics. I think someone had put them together from all your learning. So there's it's a feast for the eyes as well as the mind as well. So I recommend you look at that website. So thank you very much, Pia, and hopefully this is virtual, but hopefully we can meet in person in the future soon.
I would love so. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you.